I've got the top of the hour, and so let's begin. Welcome everybody. Welcome to the Future Trends Forum. I'm delighted to see you here today because we have a fantastic guest for a vital topic. My name is Bryan Alexander. I'm the forum's creator. I'm its host. I'm your cat herder for the next hour of conversation. We're starting something new with the very last week of 2021. We've been muttering about climate change and the climate crisis and what it means for higher education. And now, with this session, we're going to make this into a major theme. Going throughout 2022, we're going to be spending a lot of sessions exploring what the climate crisis means for colleges and universities. And I'm absolutely delighted to kick that off with a fantastic guest. Heather Short is a geologist, a climate educator who extraordinarily resigned a tenured faculty position in order to do more about teaching people about the climate crisis. She's coming to us from Vermont, so you can see behind her a gorgeous landscape of what Vermont looks like in a typical summer day. I'm really grateful to her for her time. I'm looking forward to our conversation. Let me bring her up on stage right now. Hello, Dr. Short.
Hi, how are you, Bryan?
I'm terrific. How are you doing today?
Good, pretty good.
Well, I'm glad to see you, and I love the fact that you're dressed warmly. You've got your scarf, and you've got a nice a sweater or a coat, so it's very appropriate for her.
Yeah, it is.
Heather, if I can call you Heather,
Yes.
people in the Future Trends Forum, we have a tradition. People introducing themselves by describing what they're going to be doing for the next year. Now, some people are in extraordinary position for the next year, and you are one of those extraordinary people. You've just cut loose and started an amazing phase of your career. What lies ahead for you in 2022?
Well, that's a good question. I'm hoping to be able to reach a much wider audience than just 175 students a semester. And hopefully to reach an audience who has the social, political, and economic agency to actually do something about this climate emergency that we are in the midst of and seem to be sleepwalking towards. So I'm hoping to do that through education in various ways, trying to educate folks through direct climate literacy training, trying to educate even just my friends and family, honestly, because we don't talk about this enough.
Yeah.
So, but it's all very new territory. There's no real precedent for this sort of thing, and I'm looking to hopefully be able to pay my bills out of this, but I'm not even sure. Really, it doesn't matter at this point.
Wow, that's one of the bravest things I've heard. And I'd be glad to share thoughts. I mean, I'm an independent, and I'd be glad to share my crazy, strategy and what's worked and what hasn't worked. But I think for everybody, I think we all stand to benefit from you cutting loose and sharing your knowledge with the rest of us.
Great.
Well, friends, the way the forum works is I usually kick it off with a basic question or two, and then it's up to you for all of your questions. So I'm just going to start off with a couple, but remember, use the question and answer box to type in a question or hit the raise hand to join us. You can tell from the two of us that we are warm and friendly and welcoming for your question. So the first one I have to ask, Heather, is what is academia doing wrong about the climate crisis? What are we failing to do that we should be doing instead?
Well, I think academia is like any other large institution that's been changing in the last 50 years or so. It's basically, we're not acknowledging that we're actually in a climate emergency. So we're still going forward, going through the motions, teaching our classes. Our subject matters are very interesting to us, and we enjoy teaching, most of us. And sort of doing that and keeping our heads down and not really sitting with and understanding the fact that we are fundamentally in the biggest emergency that humanity has ever faced, and that we have the time and the means to actually do something about it right now. Otherwise, what we're teaching our students, honestly, for the future is not preparing them for the future that they will have.
Well, I asked a big question and you gave an appropriately macro answer. Why? What is it which keeps us sleepwalking? What is it that there's been so much climate science and there's been so much popular efforts. I mean, Al Gore doing his thing, right? So many books. Bill McKibben circling the world to do work. What? How come? How come we're still blasé about this and we haven't figured it out?
Well, I think for a couple of reasons. I think one, there's a large lack of imagination in our general systems that we live within. We're all embedded in this system that was built on unmitigated extraction and emissions, and the system worked for us. If you're a professor at this point in your life and you have a stable job, it works, right? You get an education, you get a job, you have a house, have a car, have a dog. So for those of us who the system worked for, it's extremely difficult to imagine it not working for other people. Like you can say it intellectually, like, yes, of course, this next generation is not actually going to be better off than their parents, and et cetera, et cetera. But to actually really experience that and understand it is a totally different story. And so I think fundamentally it's a lack of imagination, and our system that we live in, for lack of a better word, doesn't really encourage a lot of imagination outside of that system. And that's exactly what we have to do.
And hence you left the system. And we have you have a colleague, by the way, in the chat. The chat will be available afterwards, but Jonathan Ports said that he just left his tenured position too.
All right.
James Olson repeats the awesome Upton Sinclair quote: "It's very hard to get someone to understand something when their salary depends on their not understanding it."
Exactly.
Well,
but I mean, just one add on to that is that it's not necessarily the individual's fault. We still live in this sort of idea that we all have choices and that we have these individual, well, I can choose to walk away. And I think everybody here knows that most people can't, and that I'm actually very privileged to be able to take this choice that matches my moral compass. Most people can't. And I think it's important to point that out.
It is. I guess my question was a kind of super big picture encompassing everything from individuals to institutions. Let me just quickly ask one: what can institutions do at the strategic level? So thinking about a whole university or a whole college, what should they be doing now in 2021's last days as we look forward to the crisis? What are some of the things they should be doing?
Okay, so I think one of the things you mentioned, strategy. I think one of the really important things is for leaders of institutions to re-examine their assumptions that their strategies are based on. So we often, and I served as chair of my department for some years, but not higher up than that. But I think institutions themselves have a lot of inertia, so it's very difficult for institutions to change. But when faced with crises, say low enrollments, the strategy is to market better, or faced with high expenses, the strategy is to try to recruit more money from donors. And what institutions need to do now is to fundamentally reassess the assumptions that go into those strategies, because as the crisis deepens, as climate disasters happen more and more frequently, which they will, those normal strategies are just not going to work. And higher education will become less and less and less relevant as our students come in through the doors and say, what, you're offering these classes? This isn't going to do me any good. So in order to stay relevant, we've got to fundamentally reassess the assumptions in terms of what higher education's purpose is. Nice kitty.
Thank you. This is some of you recognize Ash, who is a shameless video bomber. He always loved to be on video. What are some of those assumptions? For example, is one of the assumptions that enrollment will always grow, or would another assumption be our physical campus is safe?
I think these assumptions are that we're always going to remain relevant, right? Because what's happening right now is unprecedented change. Whether we see it or not, really in the global north, in wealthy communities, we don't really see it that much. But we will more. And as this massive fundamental change to our environment, and I'm not just talking about the climate or talking about pollution in the environment, I'm talking about the stability of democracies and the stability of communities and the connectedness of people. As that changes, which it will with more and more climate disasters, we need to, instead of assuming that, okay, we're going to use our experience as folks who have benefited from this continuously growing system to then predict what's the best thing to do for the future, it's nonsense, really, because the future is already so radically different from the ones that we've all grown up in and been rewarded by.
Well, those are huge assumptions, and they, in many ways, threaten where we could go as a society as a whole. And it sounds like to rethink this, we have to rethink our finances, we have to rethink our basic strategies. Friends, let me stop with the general floating of questions and turn this over to you now. What would you like to ask Dr. Heather Short? What are some of the strategies that you'd like us to pursue in academia, or that you'd like to raise? What are some of the assumptions you think we should be questioning? And what does the world look like that academia is heading into? The floor is yours. And already, as I asked you, one question has just come in, so let me bring it up on the stage for everyone to see. This is from John Hollenbeck in Wisconsin. Is this a knowledge problem or a story problem? Can we educate people, or do we need to make it part of their value? And how can academia develop a shared purpose? Brilliant, John.
I think that's great. I think it's both. So I think there is fundamentally a knowledge problem amongst folks of our generation and older, because we might have learned about the climate crisis or really this environmental stuff when we were in high school and university. But then once you're in graduate school, you're just focused on your focus and off you go. So we don't have the benefits of the scientific consensus that we have now, like to learn from in school. So the students that I were teaching have that benefit of decades of climate modeling, climate research, and we're able to become very climate literate in the space of just one semester, whereas all of the adults in their lives don't have that. So it's not really, and again, I want to sort of stress this kind of practical compassion with people. It's very easy to get angry and be like, why are you doing, it's not fair or whatever. My students have said that to me many times, but it's actually just a lack of resources from folks of our generations and older. So I think that climate literacy education is absolutely crucial in order to get people to understand the seriousness of the situation that we're in, and then also to understand the fact that we do have a short window of opportunity through which we can prevent the worst of the catastrophes. So in saying that, for myself and for all of you who are in academia, just a classroom type setting is good enough to transmit that information because that's what we're used to. We're used to sitting down and collecting information and processing it and then spitting it out on a test. And I think bringing up the idea of stories to tell is really important because most people respond better to that. So it's this is where we need a real multidisciplinary approach, where you have perhaps a panel of climate literate scientists who can then train others who are good at storytelling, or maybe through even visual arts, to tell these stories, but still all based on scientific consensus, because unfortunately we live in an age of misinformation that spreads faster than the Omicron variant, and we really need not just I think institution by institution resource to go to that is literate in the latest climate science consensus, but also probably national and international groups to go to, like the IPCC, but at every governmental level, so that we are all on the same page, we all have the same information, and then however we transmit that out to everybody, the more varied ways, the better.
Well, thank you for that wide-ranging answer and that all of the above answer. Thank you, John, for the very thoughtful question. In the chat, he adds that he feels that school derealities knowledge to the degree it's separate from reality. So climate becomes test questions, not realities, which is a nice way of saying it.
Yeah.
Friends, if you're new to the forum, that's how a Q&A question works. So type them in if you like. Now I'm going to demonstrate another feature, which is the ability to bring someone up on stage. So with absolute pleasure, I'm going to bring a former guest, a dear friend and a good supporter, Phil Long, coming to us also from Virginia. Hello, Phil.
Hello, hello. How are you doing?
Good.
And nice to meet you, Heather.
Nice to meet you, Phil.
So I'll launch into my question, but it's a question that I'm sure you'll have multiple responses to. And that is, this is one of those events that are forthcoming that isn't just portending higher inflation or increased people out of work or job losses in various sectors. We're talking about a potential extinction event that is unprecedented in the evolution of life. And we've had 5 others before this, which are presumably things we can get some learning from. Unfortunately, the time frame we have is neither linear in terms of the potential impacts or all that predictable, because we tend to delude ourselves into thinking our modeling of global systems is better than it is. And so while we can learn some things from it, there are events that will happen that will show how much we don't know about it. Most recently, the proposed spread of iodine and into the atmosphere and its impact as a significant contribution to the ozone layer's status, and the fact that it's not even included in any of the most recent models as a potential factor to consider. So the question is, in the face of that, you have a group of people here who are relatively interested and engaged and have various mechanisms of influencing modest things around them. What are some of the range of things that we can do that have some meaningful potential in the next 3 to 5 to 7 years at the most to have cataclysmic changes that will affect the way in which the countries of the world actually are cognizant of this and realize this isn't just an additional problem to add on to the list?
Okay, that's quite a big question. Yeah, so what can we do? And I think a lot of sort of doom and denial and paralysis comes from people's inability to answer that question. And to be fair, this is something that humans have never faced before. So it's it's a difficult question to answer. But from what I understand, in terms of geoengineering, which is what you were talking about, and other technologies, technology is not what we should put all our eggs in terms of baskets for climate mitigation. The way I see it is there's two main things. There's the mitigation step, and then there's this regeneration, how do we reorganize ourselves step. So I think you're just talking about mitigation at this point, which I think is important to talk about because we have a very small window of opportunity to do so. So that said, I think one of the fundamental things that has to happen is science literacy education, sort of as an appetizer to climate literacy education. And I think folks, even students nowadays at universities, think of science the way it's done as, scientific method. That's what we do. But what they don't really get a lot of is the story of how science is a collaborative endeavor, that it's something that is done by thousands of people from different backgrounds from all over the world, and that the IPCC is a sort of second round of peer review, and it's how we reach scientific consensus and all of this stuff. So I'm not sure why I went down that tangent, but what we need to do very, very quickly is to recognize that we've run out the clock, that we do not have the time for incremental changes, and be honest about that with people, but then also be honest that it's not over, right? So there's a middle path here. There's not the techno-optimism path. There's not the, oh no, it's all over, we might as well roll over and navel gaze. The middle path there is, okay, this is serious, very, very bad prognosis, but we do have the opportunity to mitigate this aggressively and quickly. And there's a lot of suggestions about how we do this, and I think really the easiest way to explain it now is go into emergency mode. So similar to how we have been dealing with the COVID crisis over the last 2 years, hopefully better than that, we go into emergency mode at all levels of government and in all communities and say, okay, normal is over, and because it is, climatically speaking, and there's no going back to normal, and provide whatever kinds of resources that we can for people to understand and cope with that. And that's going to mean things like paying people to stay home from fossil fuel jobs. That's going to mean closing down the industry immediately and not apologizing for it. So that and all of the other things that need to happen require pretty strong centralized governments that people trust. And that's another thing. It does not seem easily obtainable, but it can be done. And an analogy that I'm not super pleased with but it does work, is one of preparing for the Second World War. So the United States and Canada both went into emergency mode to prepare for the Second World War, and it was all top down. It was all, here's the new laws, here's what you're going to do for the next 5 years, and then if we all do this together, then hopefully we'll win. And it worked out. The same thing can be done for climate action, with the provision that that intense part won't be forever. So if we can make people more climate literate, if we can convince them that, okay, we need immediate massive sacrifices in your convenience and luxuries so that your children can have a livable future. We're all in this together. We'll take care of each other. And then once we get that CO2 mitigated to a certain point, we can look at how we can rebuild and restructure our cultures and communities to be better tenants on this planet.
It's particularly challenging when the duration of, or
Yes.
the time frames of solutions are generational. Humans are
Yes.
particularly inept at thinking that far ahead, let alone
Yes.
sustaining ongoing practices like massive air extraction
Yes.
of carbon dioxide, which is going to be a
Yes.
centuries-long activity. So do you have
Right.
any ideas about how we can partition these things into categories that can get people's attention in a way that the potential rolling sense of urgency just doesn't diminish with our own inability to maintain the sense of urgency and priority that this is going to take?
Well, as I think I sort of implied, I don't think that this can be voluntary. I don't think that this is something that we can go to corporations and be like, please, please, will you reduce your CO2 emissions? It's not going to work. We don't have the time for that. We've been doing that for decades. What we have to do is, I think that as a three sort of pronged approach. We have to educate students in a formal setting. The younger generations mostly just for the regenerative part of it, because they don't really have a lot to say about ending the fossil fuel industry. Well, they have a lot to say, but they don't have any means to do it. And then a climate literacy training for all adults. So either in their workplaces or in community centers where everybody has the very basic facts about, okay, what's a system? What are feedbacks in systems? Why do we want to avoid these feedbacks from starting? What happens once they do start? Well, they will eventually run out and the climate will stabilize. But the sooner that we stop emitting CO2, the more livable that climate will be. And I think if people understand that, and then we have a public information campaign that keeps that ongoing. I understand that social media has a really great way of undoing science and scientific facts, but I think we have to appeal to people and their sense of being all in this together, that we're not actually just individuals competing against each other, that humans are here primarily because for the most part of our existence, we were in cooperation with each other. So I think we need to provide people with those stories and keep them going. But yeah, there's no way that we can mitigate emissions in the next 3 to 5 years without laws.
Thank you.
Phil, thank you. Fantastic questions. And thank you, Heather, for that bracing answer. Before I can say anything more, we have another person who wants to join us. Phil, let me keep you up here just because you've got the cool headphones and the cool shirt. So let me just see if we can put 4 of us on stage at once. I'm going to bring in James Olson. I picked on him before. Now he gets payback time. Hello.
Good to be here.
Hi, James.
And Heather, thank you for joining us today, and thank you for the work that you're doing. I really appreciate the approach that you're taking of kind of individual compassion when you're speaking about any one person, especially given the incredible pressures that any of us might face in the systems we're in. Yet we've got to have focus on the systems and thinking about higher education or any of our own individual universities as a system, then think about what would it be to go into like a pandemic style emergency mode on this issue. And a lot of what you're talking about involves, I think, an outreach to the community, which I'm very much in favor of. But I'm very much thinking about my students this next semester. I'm teaching an ethics of climate change class, and I know it's going to happen because it happens every semester where I get these great students and they're passionate and they learn a ton and they just want an avenue of outlet for their passion, and in particular, an outlet within our university community. So what advice would you give to me and to my students if what we want to do is to try to help the university system, which does know better? It does understand that we're in an emergency. I mean, I don't know anybody that's at that I rub shoulders with who doesn't recognize that we're in a state of emergency, and yet we're not mobilizing. So what advice would you have for my students and myself in terms of what we can do to try to help our individual institution to mobilize?
Just a quick question, Heather, before you jump in. Do you have headphones by any chance?
Do I have headphones? No.
Okay. We just have
Sorry,
there's a slight
is it echoing?
feedback. There's a little bit, and I'm trying to mute it as I can, but don't worry. Keep going. Please address James's big question.
Okay, the big question. Well, I tried, and I rather fell on my face a bit to change my own institution. And I expected that because they, like I said, people are stuck in one reality that worked for them, and they're not really anxious to change because it's really scary. So one of the things that I did over the course of teaching climate science and then trying to educate my peers about it was I looked into climate psychology. And one of the large reasons I think why people, the adults in the room, are not responding to this as an emergency, even though we know it's an emergency, is because it's just too damn scary. And we're all humans. And I think the way around that is to, again, have this sort of practical compassion for people who are still in what I call passive denial, because nobody's walking around, well, some people are, but most people aren't walking around anymore, especially at higher institutions, saying, oh, well, it's a hoax. Most people are like, wow, it's really bad, it's scary, and yes, we should do something about it. Okay, what's for lunch? You know, kind of thing. So, because it's just too much. So what has to happen, and this sounds funny coming from scientists, is that we actually need to talk about our emotions. And we need to talk about our emotions from human to human on a very, and for me, it's always from a practical perspective, but having the opportunity to talk with your colleagues or have your students go home and talk to their parents and say, look, I'm really freaked out about this. I'm really upset about this. And I want you to know, and I want you to try to do something about it. So one of the things I had my students do as an exercise was what I called climate conversations. And we learned about climate psychology. We learned about cognitive dissonance and how people will tell themselves one thing and their actions do the opposite because it's just too hard to reconcile. And then we talked about ways of getting around that cognitive dissonance. And basically the way to do it is to participate in some sort of action collectively. So we're not talking about recycling more. We're not talking about riding your bike to school. We're talking about getting your family together, getting friends together, and maybe in this case, perhaps getting administrators out and doing something collectively like blocking traffic. Wouldn't that be great? or something like, because there's also a lot of talk, not at my institution, but of incorporating activism also into climate courses, even climate science courses, because at this point, that is what students can participate in. And a lot of my students would say like, oh, what's the point of going to a march? It doesn't do anything. And that's actually not true. Marches and demonstrations change people's perspective. It opens that Overton window of possibility of what is considered nowadays a legitimate thing to do or a thing that's possible. So changing the Overton window, I think, is something that students can really can really benefit from. And they won't necessarily see the results right away, but they'll be able to hopefully feel like they're part of something. But I'd also honestly try to get them to change the structure of the administration of your university. Why not?
I appreciate that. Thank you.
It would be nice if one of the many additional administrators on our campuses was associated with coordinating the system-wide activities of the campus in response to climate change and coordinating them. That would be an administrative post I could actually support.
So exactly. So, but what we need to do though is involve people collectively and in collaboration to change the culture of the institutions that we work for. So not just having one administrator, even though, yeah. I mean, when I left my post, I proposed to change it into something like that, being a climate literacy specialist, in which I would then train all of my colleagues in climate literacy so that when the students learn what they did in my classroom and then left my classroom, they wouldn't just be going back on the business as usual train and thinking like, oh, I've got to do really well so I can get in a good, graduate program or something. Because that doesn't help them. They walk out into a world of denial, and that basically denies the trauma that they're already experiencing and that they will experience in their life because of climate breakdown. So what we need to do, I think, fundamentally is get everybody educated about the climate crisis on the same page, know the details, so that when students leave your classroom, they will feel supported and that everybody around them is also working towards the same goal, which is not what the traditional university goals are, which is to get somebody ready to participate in a continuously growing economy on a finite planet.
Great questions, James and Phil and Heather. Thank you so much. I'm actually going to bring you two down, Phil and James, because you've been very great. I want to make some room for other folks. We've just, if you're new to the forum, this is the way it works. We have all kinds of questions, and the chat box has hit up a whole bunch of additions. Brian Mulligan has asked a really great question of, do we have research that individual conversations will work and soon enough? John Hollenbeck also asked a sobering question, or an observation rather. Maybe we're seeing the limits of academia to bring about needed change. So these are really, really solid problems that we should be thinking about. We had another question. I want to bring a speaker up to stage. This is David Thurlow, I believe, who had a very good question. And I was going to ask it for him, but I think actually he'll do it better than me. And he's with the Associated Colleges of the South International School. Is that right, David? Or is ACS something else?
That's right. Yeah, so the question I had was, notwithstanding the emergency mode, because I take that, what can I do? What can my institution do to address the climate emergency? But beyond that, how can we get sustainability to be the paradigm shift so that it makes its way into the heart of learning experience design and curriculum development? And we need to address the complex problem with a complex approach rather than addressing the kind of complicated problem of industrialism with, which button do I press to get the number to change? Because that's not how simple. It's not simple like that. And we're not going to be able to make it simple like that. So how can we get the paradigm shift to happen? I think what you just said about going to a university and asking them to create a position is interesting, but it's still kind of marginal to the science department or marginal to the climate department. And how can we get that, going all the way down? I think it goes all the way down to little kids' education. Sustainability is at the heart of our thinking now. The paradigm has to shift. And culture eats strategy for breakfast. So we need to change the culture. The strategy is not going to be enough.
Okay, so I missed some of that. It was a little bit robot voice, but I think what I got mostly was that what can you do as an individual who works at an institution, and then how can we get our university to do something that is meaningful rather than just sort of a side dish, new office, new administrative position. Is that about right?
Yeah, it's not.
I can't.
The paradigm needs to shift. We're not just. Yeah. Okay. Check the chat.
Check the chat. That's all right.
I don't know what's causing the audio tonight. Sometimes we have that.
It could be me. Who knows? So let's see. Where are we? Down here.
I can bring it up.
Okay, thank you.
So a question came out: how can we take sustainability as a complex challenge, and how can that take the place of a very complicated industrialism at the center of the curriculum, at the heart of learning experience design? Can existing institutions do this?
That's a good question. I'm not sure they can. So what it really is going to take is an institution that's set up to be a teaching institution instead convert their thinking into being a learning institution, because what has to happen is the whole administrative structure, the organizational structure of universities needs to be able to be nimble, and it needs to change rapidly in response to the changing climate and environment. So it's not a small ask, actually. And that was one of the things my administrator said to me when I proposed this new climate literacy position, was that, wow, that's a lot to ask. I'm like, well, it is the biggest crisis humanity's ever faced. But I think, gosh, I keep going back to education, but I think it really necessitates educating administrators very, very carefully so that they really understand the full impact of where we are right now, and make them understand that they're not just going to sort of adjust a little bit here and there to remain relevant. That literally the continuation of higher learning as an institution is at stake here, because within the next 30 years, other factors in people's lives and students' lives are going to be far more important to deal with, like getting away from wildfires and floods and a tanking economy, than worrying about, how good the sustainability program is at XYZ university. So I think we need to make it plain and very clear that change is coming. Fundamental, radical change is coming, whether we want it or not. So the way to deal with this is to welcome that change and try to steer it in a direction that will mean that our institutions of higher learning are still relevant and open after 30, 40 years. So, and it's really hard to get people to hear that and believe that. But there's lots of information out there about what the climate crisis is going to do to economies. There's lots of information out there about how different parts of the world will be directly affected by natural disasters. And this is something that we have to plan for, and that universities, if they want to stay relevant, have to plan for. So personally, I don't even like the idea of the name sustainability, because I think it has this idea that we'll still be able to keep going the way we are, business as usual, but just be a little bit green, or, recycle more, or, get off our CO2 emissions. And that's not even close to the radical changes that are coming. Did I answer your question?
I think you started to, but I think you muted yourself, David.
I muted myself?
No, okay.
No, David, I think you muted yourself.
It says that I'm not muted now. All right.
Now you're good.
Yeah. When I say sustainability, I'm thinking in the profound sense. I don't really care what the words are, actually. I think the point that I'm making is that until that kind of thinking has permeated, it's not sustaining normal. That's not what I mean by sustainability. Sustainability in the truest sense means that the ecosystem can continue to provide. If we're thinking about the world requiring engineering to achieve sustainability, that's an industrial solution. So if you want to reflect sunlight to cool the atmosphere, or you want to do giant, Bill Gates style engineering, then maybe that's a definition that we're going to argue about in the future. Do we trust nature, or do we have to do it? That's also a very interesting point. I think in the past, when we confronted emergencies, the idea of pitching in together, teaching what was relevant, and taking action together was really powerful. And it's just been really hard since the pandemic to get any kind of cohesion where people would say, we agree on what we need to do. We agree on what the solution is, whether that's fear or, I think, complacency and the satisfaction of immediate stimulation that mobile telephony provides. It's like the social aspect of things, where we really engage with what sustainability means, that's where we're lacking the ability to build consensus and drive change.
That's a good thought. Thank you, David. That's a great comment. Heather, do you want to take a run at that, or should we?
So I think what I heard was that the even with COVID, people were not necessarily coming together to try to come to a solution. Is that what I heard?
Well, there's the point of sustainability not being necessarily a phrase to bring people together, but a question of trying to come up with a new paradigm beyond the industrial.
Yes.
So the World War II paradigm is a good one. I mean, that's a good one to think through. But the question is, David, I hope I'm getting you right, that in the 21st century we have a post-industrial economy, and we have a problem which is very, very different at a fundamental level. So what would be a new paradigm to organize people around?
That's a very good question, and I'm not sure anybody really has a good answer for that. And certainly, ooh, is that doing weird voice things? I think that what we need to focus on instead is more collaboration and mutual aid rather than competition, because our whole paradigm that we all grew up in was competition and organizing, your life and getting the education that you need, and then your whole success is on your own shoulders. So we need to, and I've said this to my students often, we need to redefine success. We need to redefine what our goals as educators are, instead of success being students getting really high marks and then going on to whatever programs they want and getting good jobs and making lots of money. We instead need to focus on a culture of care and collaboration and community building instead. And I know that sounds a bit Vermont-y, maybe, for lack of a better word, but it's what makes sense. And we need to get people to be involved at the local level in their local politics, be involved in decision making, and instead of fostering this competitiveness and this dissociation from each other, because I think that's the fundamental step in disassociating us from the natural world that keeps us alive.
Thank you for that crystalline answer, Heather. And David, thank you for persisting through video issues, and thank you for the very deep question. I think we'll be spending a lot of time trying to think about this, and I don't think any other organization on earth is as well suited to rethinking a new paradigm as higher education. But we are suited for running out of time, and I want to make sure everyone gets a chance to ask their questions. So let me flash on the screen one from our dear friend Steve Ehrman, who asks, the institution decides to gear up to have all students do some meaningful climate-related projects each year. Are there enough climate-related academic projects for that to work at scale?
I would say yes, absolutely. But I think the focus is a bit still sort of on the periphery there. I think what we need to do, instead of doing like a big, doing our normal educational course and then doing a side project about climate, we need to make our whole educational course about how do we live on a planet without destroying it and thereby destroying ourselves. So that's the sort of fundamental change that needs to happen. And if it doesn't, then educational institutions won't exist in another 100 years, honestly. So what we need to do is, instead of thinking about this like, well, how can we just, use the same structure and the same framework and then sort of add into it these initiatives, we have to think, how can we structure our entire educational system around being a good tenant on this planet, basically.
And how can we do that when we're not really thinking anywhere near that? George Station in the chat had this good point, kind of grim point, where he said that how can we do this without just having like a 2-year course development project and a few workshops and then move on? Quote, yet another requirement that is a top priority of the institution. That's really hard. We only have a couple of minutes. I want to ask one last question as a moderator, and that is if we're looking at a problem that is in many ways a century plus problem. We're looking at something which will take a great deal of time and occur on time scales way beyond the 3-month horizon that business prefers or the 6 to 12-month horizon that academia prefers. How can we get academics, everybody from students to faculty, presidents, trustees, technologists, librarians, how can we start thinking and then acting on that kind of time scale?
So I think the long-term timescale it'll work itself out on its own, because if we don't respond to the immediate crisis of stopping our dependence on fossil fuels in the next 5 years, then we won't really have a long-term thing to worry about, because we will be much more concerned with the natural disasters that will be everywhere on the planet. There's nowhere safe. So what we really need to do is to, I think, for adults, those of us with agency to do something about this, focus on mitigation very quickly. And the way to do this is to have many voices, so not just, the weirdo climate scientists, but many voices who understand the urgency that we need to act, to then keep at it, keep telling those of us above us who make the decisions and policy and create the culture of the institution that we work at, tell them to make different choices and don't let up. So it can become uncomfortable. People will stop inviting you to dinner, but whatever. It's the world that's at stake. So that, and then change our educational institutions so that they remain relevant to the students that will be coming into them in the next decades. And what that means is teaching them different skills. So not necessarily preparing them to participate in a world that we participated in, because it's not going to exist for them. We have to be able to have that self-reflection as individuals, but as institutions, as communities, to say, okay, we have to learn now how to think differently, how to behave differently, so that we can do our best to prepare these students for the future. And I don't think any one person has a roadmap for that. I think what it's going to take is a collaboration of experts at higher institutions who are all on the same climate page, so that they can work out exactly what the nuts and bolts of that are going to mean.
I'm so impressed, Heather. I'm blown away by you in general, but I'm so impressed that you were able to take my gigantic question and to turn it all the way down in scale to the question of individual teaching, and then having people think in terms not of the students that are here right now, but the students to be here in a decade or so. I think that's a powerful move, and I can't do your comments enough justice. Thank you so much for being with us for this hour, and for so generously and deeply answering our barrage of questions. What's the best way for keeping up with you, Heather? Is it going to be your homepage or your Twitter account?
Yeah, so I have a nascent webpage just at which people can contact me, and there's also a link there to my Gmail account for work purposes. So yeah, that'd be great. I might even set up a forum on my homepage.
Well, that would be awesome. And you should, friends, on the bottom left of the screen, you should see a Dr. Short's homepage button that you can click on to learn more. With that, we need to wrap things up. Heather, thank you so much. Please stay warm and enjoy the month, and we will follow up. Please keep up the great work.
Great, thanks.
Friends, we have to wrap up. I want to thank you for all of your really, really great questions. This has been a very heady, very deep discussion, and I'm really impressed that we were able to do this on New Year's Eves. Looking ahead into the new year, we have a whole series of topics, which I mentioned before. You can go to forum.futureofelducation.us to learn more. If you want to keep talking about this, some of you have already been tweeting about this, please use the hashtag FTTE. You can tweet at me, Bryan Alexander, or Shindig Events. And of course, I'm blogging about this, so you can just go to bryanalexander.org for more spots. If you'd like to go into the past and look at our previous conversations, including some of the questionnaires, just go to tinyurl.com/FTF archive. I hope you all have a fantastic New Year's. Thank you for coming in during a holiday break. I really appreciate that. I hope all of you are safe and sound during this rising Omicron wave. I'm really grateful for the chance to think with you together, and I look forward to thinking with you and talking with you over the next year. Take care, everyone. Be safe. I'll see you online. Bye-bye.